Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Turnip's Digest, starting right on time as usual. I am joined today by Not Me, Not You. How are you, sir?
Doing great, Ryan. Feeling very punctual.
Fantastic. And Charlemagne, how are you doing?
Good morning, feeling very morning.
Yeah, I've forced both of you guys to embrace the Protestant work ethic, as has become a meme on this channel. Getting Catholic guests on to uh, force them awake bright and early on the weekend. So thank you both for joining me. We have a very monumental topic to discuss today. Not that the events themselves were actually inherently monumental, but they have certainly been manufactured that way after the fact. 3 years ago today, as anyone I'm sure remembers, I don't think we're far enough away from it yet that people would have just read about it. We had certain events that happened at the Capitol that have been described as very violent, rebellious, and in violation of the 14th Amendment for all involved. And this has been used today in the present as we go into the election year next year to basically just do a bunch of legal shenanigans. I think would be the best way to describe that, if not just outright banning the opposition. So, with all of that stated, I remember I was in an English class whenever all this kicked off, and it was we were, I believe, going over Hamlet, one of the Shakespeare things that you have to read in the public schools if you're in the advanced classes or the normal classes, I presume, as well. And I remember just a bunch of people on Twitter were live reporting everything that was happening, and I was somewhat excited. I remember that a lot of the Europeans, especially, were fretting quite madly about having some sort of a large crackdown on absolutely everyone, as if we were going to all be rounded up the next day because people dared to oppose the regime. I don't think that any of those wildest dreams ever came to fruition. I just think that we've seen a very soft and subtle crackdown. Things have been forgotten, certainly. So that's what I remember. And I specifically want to highlight that as well, that I don't think that we had the harshest crackdown possible in response to this. I think that might have been forgotten a little bit if you weren't talking to people at the time. But yeah, what do you guys remember of it? Because it's a pretty big event.
Yeah, I mean, alas for our European fellows, the tyranny here is not quite as bad as the tyranny over there yet. So they're going to have to wait for us to catch up to them. Yeah, I mean, I remember the reports, like everything was confused, right? The people were saying multiple people had been shot, and there wasn't really any kind of agreement on it. I remember Tim Pool losing his mind as he usually does, which is pretty funny. As for how it's remembered, like I am very curious because there must be new versions of history textbooks now that discuss it. I am very curious to see how that lines up with all of our memories of it in the future.
Yeah, I'm certain that we have our American versions, but I think it was posted on Christmas this year. I think it was a Russian textbook that was saying that Trump lost the 2020 election due to electoral fraud. I think is what the Russians were putting out. So I'm sure we'll have the exact opposite, as has become tradition in the last few decades. So, Charlie, what was your impression in the wake of it? Things that might have been forgotten, things that you remember, and all of that. I feel like that would be a good perspective to get.
Well, I remember a major confusion. I was spectating the events, on the 6th through my internet connection rather jealously, since I suppose before everything went down, I kind of wished I was there because I had gone to the 2 million MAGA marches and, sort of regretted that I wasn't able to make the third and final big march, which probably ended up for the better given how things went. But yeah, it was very confusing because, you watch the Trump speech in the morning and then suddenly you're watching videos of people sort of protesting around the Capitol, I guess much more aggressively than happened during the Million MAGA March. And, then we started to see the whole deployment of tear gas, and the crowd sort of hitting the police line, and it was clear that like something different was going on in terms of how the crowd was behaving that day than during the Million MAGA marches, which were more just like parades. And it was very confusing because you didn't really know what was going on while it was happening. We saw, I can't even remember if we saw any footage from actually inside the building at that point. I don't think we did. It was just a lot of screenshots and video clips of people who were there just uploading the outside of the Congress to Twitter and whatnot. And of course, then you get that very weird Trump speech where he tells everyone to go home, and then he apparently flies off in a helicopter, and everyone was just sort of left like, what the heck just happened? I think no one really understood quite what exactly happened on January 6th on the day, and even days after it went down. The days after it went down were actually, I think, not commented on very much, but it was a very surreal period. I recall that President Trump wanted a few like final went to a few final events. Like I remember him going to the border wall in Mexico to meet and greet and that sort of thing, and it just seemed like really weird for him to be sort of acting in this business as usual way after the January 6th events. So it was a very surreal time. That's probably the number one thing I remember about experiencing the actual events from afar, like most everyone did. It's just how surreal the whole period was.
Right, and I think that this might be something worth saying as well, is that this was very much like just a political pressure event, primarily, or at least as most people saw it, because everyone was very focused on the legality of how an election worked, and this was specifically just to be like a political pressure against the vice president certifying the results. I don't feel like that actually gets mentioned anymore at all. People just kind of say like suddenly a rabid mob of people showed up at the Capitol because they didn't like what happened in the election and then stormed it.
Well, that's how they're claiming it in retrospect. I mean, at the time, it was quite clear. I mean, any reasonable person would recognize exactly what Trump said, which is that it was a political pressure rally to try and get the vice president to undergo a apparently legal procedure of not counting the electoral ballots as they ended up being counted, and it was really nothing more than that. And yes, certain events took place that were a bit more aggressive than during the MAGA marches, but ultimately that wasn't the intent of the rally. And as we know as well, people were already at the Capitol building, sort of engaging with the police, during Trump's speech. So I guess the problem with, and we'll get into this when we look at the cases, I guess, is the problem is the argument that President Trump was inciting the insurrection, when you can't, it's hard to see how you can say his speech incited it when the events were already taking place concurrent with it that he had no knowledge of whatsoever. So yeah, it was just a normal political pressure rally, and that's it really.
Yeah, I mean, you can also tell that by reactions to it, because everyone remembers Ted Cruz flipping on a dime, right? So he was all about questioning the integrity of the election until the events of the 6th. So then after that he switched. So you'd figure that if he had detected anything in Trump's rhetoric about trying to incite something like that, he would have called it out beforehand. But with Ted Cruz, we're talking about we're not exactly talking about a reliable actor here, but yeah, I do remember the rhetoric coming from Trump was mostly like, just we're showing up to show how much popular support there is for this notion that the election was not legitimate, and Mike Pence do something.
Right, and I feel like this might be worth saying as well, is that from the perspective of the average left-wing extremist or revolutionary, basically every single Republican is complicit. So this whole flip that came from a lot of those types there, the sort of pseudo-populist or pseudo-radical types, it's very much a self-defeating move. I don't really understand what they gained by it, unless there's like a like ultra status quo faction within the within Congress and within the ruling class that just rewards them for not going too terribly far and ensures that they won't get chopped, basically. It seems very, very strange, almost as if there was a miscalculation there. But I don't know, maybe you all would have a different opinion on that. Perhaps not, though. So, with all of that said, Charlie, you earlier alluded to how it's been construed rather than how it all actually happened, and I felt like this might be good to go over because I've actually got here articles from the New York Times and CNN, people that you would probably not trust to tell you basically anything factual about history, let alone something that just happened and is a political issue currently. But I find this whole idea that there was extreme violence on January 6th to be very interesting because even as they will admit, the only actual death that resulted from all of this was inflicted by the Capitol onto the protesters. And then basically everything that they tried to construe within the first few hours is being inflicted by the protesters onto Capitol and state enforcement. Turns out to actually not have been linked to it. So here we have on screen right now an article from the New York Times. And they're talking about the casualties of January 6th, and they have a few listed. We have Ashley Babbitt, who became somewhat famous afterwards, Air Force veteran, shot by police. And then you have a couple of people that had strokes and heart attacks just at the same time. And then you have this one Boyland, who was apparently crushed in a stampede by the rioters. Only until you look at what was happening down here, just neatly tucked under all the fancy bullet points, where it says Miss Boylan's death was caused by an overdose, and then even CNN will agree that it was an amphetamines overdose. So far, the only actual casualty that is admitted to was inflicted onto the protesters, which suddenly does not sound so violent anymore. In fact, if I have a feeling that if different people were writing media reports in the history, this would start to look like one of those 1960s or 1970s protests where the state comes down with a heavy hand and then suddenly it's a giant tragedy because these good protesters who didn't do a single thing died. I find this to be very interesting, Charlie. Do you have any sort of comment here?
Well, the central argument about the insurrection is that they were attempting to disrupt the execution of the Constitution. And if they were attempting to do that, you would expect the violence to be more concentrated on the security forces around the actual Senate chambers, or House chambers rather, and maybe members of the House themselves, but that appears to not be the case. There's no indication just reading from this list. Like if you just read this list of people who were injured, just sort of in a vacuum, you wouldn't think that this is clearly an attempt to stop some sort of government proceeding from happening. In fact, it looks more like it's an attempt. It's the opposite. It looks more like it's an attempt by security forces to disrupt the people's right to protest.
Right, and go on, Curtis.
I'm sorry. I was just gonna piggyback on what Charlie was saying. Yeah, I mean, where were the weapons? Like, why didn't if the people who were engaged in the rioting on the 6th were intending to do some kind of insurrection or coup, like, why wouldn't they have brought weapons? It's not like it would have been hard for a crowd that size to bring them. The police can't arrest everyone, right? So it's just kind of incongruous with this idea that the reason that people showed up was to violently storm the Capitol and do whatever it is that the media was kind of saying that they were there to do.
Right. I think no single member of the crowd fired a weapon the entire day, as far as I know. Obviously, it would have been trivial for any of these people to bring, concealed firearms into the Capitol building. I mean, probably thousands of people were in that building, maybe even tens of thousands rotating through it by the end. Who knows how many people actually went through? But let's just say 1,000. Apparently, none of them had any firearm. That seems like the most the only firearm that was actually used was the one that killed Ashley Babbitt, as far as we could tell. They
Right.
didn't even attempt to arrest firearms for any of the security forces that were in there. I mean, if I recall, the guards outside near or outside the chamber near Ashley Babbitt, if I recall, they actually had AR-15s on them, and you didn't see the crowd, which was pressing against them, practically trying to like take the weapons away and use them against the congressmen who were like several feet away at that point. So it just, there are no events that indicate an intent of actual violence against the congressman at all by anybody.
Yeah, and
Right.
just before, sorry, I just wanted to get this out before we move off the point. Because we did see the people outside the building that were rioting take certain non-lethal devices from the police, so like pepper ball, like a bear mace and things like that. So if there had been an intent to do serious damage, as you were saying, Charlie, like why wouldn't they also do the same for the fully lethal rounds or the fully lethal weapons there?
Right, and this certainly has to be a first for a rebellion or an insurrection, where the people being charged with it were basically an unarmed and non-violent. Basically, that's basically what this comes down to. This giant mob of people that is at once these coup-happy, rebellious insurrectionists were also unarmed and the only people to take casualties during this entire thing. I don't understand how you could even possibly try to prove that unless you just try to use brute force in every single arm of narrative making to actually bring that about.
Yeah, well, the problem is the definition of insurrection they're using is, well, I have it here, a rising against civil or political authority, the open and active opposition of a number of persons to the execution of law in a city or state. So they're claiming, that these people were trying to prevent the law from being executed, and they don't overstate the case, I guess, rather wisely in terms of how this is all being framed. They don't overstate it as if it is a rebellion or actual like the levying of wars or something like that.
Right. Well, we'll get into that in a second, I'm sure. Just because that's going to be like the second half of the show, but it would do, especially our audience, well to remember what we were talking about beforehand. That this was organized purely around like the function of the law, where these people were trying to pressure like a legal function to happen, something that can legally happen, which would be very strange to then say that this is interfering with the function of the law. But we'll elaborate on that soon. Just because also on the list of casualties are very non-suspicious suicides by the officers that were actually present and witnessed the whole thing. I don't know. Just looking at this list, looking at the top, seeing that there was only one death that was actually caused by this directly, and it was on the protester side. And then suddenly the whole narrative is being switched basically as the story was coming out. Very strange that all these witnesses on the Capitol side would just start to commit suicide suddenly. Like some of these guys had families, if I recall correctly. I don't know. Seems strange to me. And then another thing that hasn't really aged too terribly well was the original claim was that the Sicknick police officer here from the Capitol was attacked by the mob and then died from the wounds sustained from the mob while he was fending them off. When the medical examiner ruled that he just had multiple strokes after the confrontation with the mob, natural causes. So,
I mean, it looks like the media is at least being consistent here because we all remember St. Floyd was determined by the media to have been killed by strangulation before the medical examiner came out and said, "Oh, it turns out it was actually a fentanyl overdose." So they're just, it seems that the media is just kind of really want to sensationalize things, which I know is surprising everyone listening to this, but not only sensationalizing things, but just going so far as to either entirely fabricate a cause of death to sensationalize it, or just to unquestioningly publish a rumor, which, it makes one wonder what the media thinks their purpose is.
right. And I mean, getting something so terribly wrong as trampled by the mob, and that's the cause of death, to the cause of death being amphetamine overdose, would be enough to make you wonder maybe they're just making it up on the spot to craft a narrative that they want to push. Yeah, maybe there is just no rumor. Maybe they want to push something.
Yeah, well, in terms of the role of the police in all of this, I think it's pretty clear at this point if the entire argument is based around, well, in terms of why these quote unquote suicides may have happened, if the argument is that President Trump is guilty of insurrection because he incited the insurrection, I think it's fairly obvious at this point that the federal agencies did far more to actually incite the insurrection in a much more direct manner through the operations that were underway that we now have footage of on camera, clearly demonstrating the provocateur, the agent provocateurs that the Capitol Police or FBI or whoever else. It's not exactly clear necessarily who is involved, but it's pretty clear that there were federal agent provocateurs doing far more to physically in the building incite insurrectionary behavior than President Trump, which
Right.
perhaps these gentlemen were witness to. I don't know.
And this is interesting as well because it's actually become somewhat mainstream. But they were never actually able to sort of pull their way out of explaining why it is that a mob of basically just unarmed, normal, random people from the heartlands were able to push into perhaps one of the most secure places in the country that was being guarded by armed men. This has never happened before in history. Every famous storming that anyone has ever heard of, either both sides were unarmed and it was just a giant brawl, or both sides were armed and it became somewhat bloody, or one side surrendered. This hasn't really actually happened before in history, where a defensible location was stormed by force. It has happened before where they were let in, which it's a very mainstream talking point now, and I think basically everyone knows it. But I think this is a part of just how flimsy this narrative is, how forced it is, was that this basic fact was never actually elaborated upon until footage was shown proving it, as if that was needed to break this logical conundrum here. How did they get inside?
Yeah, we can also keep in mind that the proceedings were well underway while the protesting was happening and continued well into the people being inside the building. So, in terms of the actual congressional proceedings being disrupted, you could very easily just say, well, that was caused by the congressmen overreacting to what they thought could have been a threat to themselves because they didn't actually know what was going on, as far as I know, and the Capitol Police just let the people in for the most part. So it's hard to say that there's some sort of in terms of who bears responsibility for the interruption. There's no. It's difficult to conceive how the events that say resulted in Ashley Babbitt being murdered right outside the House chambers, how those people could have even been there to disrupt anything if the Capitol Police didn't allow them in.
Right, and then you mentioned as well that proceedings were underway, and they basically shut everything down and rushed everyone into
Right.
safe chambers under the Capitol. Which I think that even at the time, I think people saw that as an extreme measure. I remember seeing memes of like people putting the congressman, editing the congressman into like these underground chambers, having them crying, having them have Voyak faces and whatever else, and basically just lambasting them because like a bunch of just normal Americans walked into the building, basically invited. And I remember that was the theory that was circulating as well as it was unfolding, was there's no way they got in without violence, without just being let in. Everyone could
Right.
see this as it was happening. So everyone was lambasting them from minute one, that this was an overreaction. They're too scared to actually face the public when they're right there with them. They view them as a threat. They had to go into safety until everything was cleared out. And you can see this after the fact as well. What did this supposedly violent rampaging mob do? They went into the offices and put their feet up onto the desks of the congressmen. Very violent and intimidating, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, it's like when they overreact that way, you kind of wonder, like, well, if you're so afraid of people seeing what you're doing and you're, fleeing the scene of the crime, I mean, what does that really say, right? That's what it looks like to me. But also, if you again going with intent, I mean, a couple of people, most notably the QAnon shaman, right, kind of walked around in the House chamber. But it's like, okay, well, if the intent of this mob apparently was to disrupt the proceedings, like, wouldn't they have swarmed the actual chambers in an attempt to find the people? But if you look back on the video footage, there were just a few people walking around in the House chambers. I think, most people would understand they're not supposed to be in there, right? Of course, there were still security guards present in there. So as far as we could tell, the security forces made no effort to not prevent even people from entering, but even like let people know, like, hey, you're not supposed to go in there. Like, doors were simply opened, everyone was allowed to go anywhere. So the police just facilitated moving people to that area of the building with no attempt to actually direct where they could or could not go. So even after they left, because the people in there didn't know what the congressmen were doing. They could have had every reason to believe they were still in the chamber, and yet no one swarmed it.
Right, and it might be worth pointing out this isn't actually very different to how like it normally works, except that the mass of people inside the Capitol are multiplied, basically. Like I remember when I was really young, I was in grade school, and I was my class at the time was in DC just to tour around and look at everything. And this was during election year; tensions were high. When you walked into like the Congress, they would have some things roped off, but sometimes the ropes wouldn't be actually attached or whatever, and it was basically just understood you weren't supposed to go into various different places. You could just walk in, and the people that were standing around, tour guides, security or whatever, would not actually do very much unless you got past a certain point. A lot of this just seems to be like business as normal, just taken a little bit farther. They don't actually normally see these things as a threat if someone wanders in.
Well, I think for the purposes of the narrative, the official narrative is conflating like two different January 6th that did occur at the same time. So anyone I've talked about this a couple of times before, but on either side of the building, east-west of the Capitol, there were like two very different crowds. So on the west side, there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of clashing with the police, but those people weren't able to get into the building, as far as I have been able to tell, because the police were fighting them back from the doors. Meanwhile, on the other side, on the east side, which anyone who's been there knows that if you're on the east side of the Capitol, you have no idea what's going on the west side of the Capitol building. On the east side is where the doors were opened and the protesters were allowed in to wander the halls. So it kind of allows this, again, this kind of confusion of reality that the regime loves playing on, where there was violence and there was like rioters clashing with the police. That absolutely happened. But those people didn't get into the building. The people who got into the building, the ones who are being persecuted and arrested, they were peacefully wandering the halls. But because the narrative can be kind of blended and combined, they're able to sell this violent protesters got into the Capitol and were trying to arrest or harm the congressman. Because we all remember that the very iconic image of a man in a ski mask with heavy duty zip ties like hanging off of his belt, which is a very suspect image in general. But yeah, I think the reason that they're able to craft this narrative is because there's elements of truth all over it that they were able to kind of combine into a narrative that is largely untrue in its assertions.
Right, as with every narrative that's pushed by the media, especially in the last 100 years, the whole thing is not purely fabricated, and they'll take these elements of basically just for plausible deniability in case that something gets disproven, where they can say, "Oh, but this was happening, so we weren't fully wrong." I don't know. Is there such thing as a modern protest in the United States that doesn't have street battles associated with it? That would be something interesting for me to find out at the very least, just because this seems very much expected, regardless of who's actually doing the protesting, just for some sort of clash to happen. Like, I don't think there is such thing as a peaceful protest anymore, especially not in the last few decades. So they're painting this as like violent protesters and storming, and as you just pointed out, the actual violent people weren't on the side that actually was let in. This is and we know that for a fact, just by looking at the pictures of the people who were in there and the videos and whatever else. I think that the perhaps the most striking image to come from this whole thing was the picture of like that one grandmother holding the flag in one of the chambers, the hallways or something. Basically elderly, grandmotherly looking, and all of that stuff. And this is the kind of person being lumped in with all the violent protesters and whatever else. I've never heard of a violent storming of a building that had old grandmothers waving, patriotic flags associated with it, just standing around and smiling for cameras.
Oh yeah, that
doesn't add up.
In that image, that woman was positively giddy. You couldn't really, unless you're trying to say that this, like, she had to have been in her 70s, right? This 70-something-year-old woman is overcome by the bloodlust that there was a lot of violence raging around her.
Yeah, one might be able to say she was a tier 1 spec ops grandma.
That's how they get you, boys.
Yeah. So, I think that we've pretty well shown here that just with stuff that was coming out basically within like the first hour or so of this whole thing going down, things didn't really make sense. And even the mainstream, the propaganda organs that are meant to be perpetrating this any recrafting of a narrative that needs to be done by power, they also aren't even going fully in with the narrative. They're basically what this article admits here, and what CNN admits as well. Two famously dissident organs of propaganda. I'm sure we would all recognize. They're basically just saying the only actual death, not just that's not linked to the Capitol stuff, but actually caused by it, was a protester being shot. That's the only casualty that we have that isn't just these people died at the same time, of completely either unrelated causes or natural causes. That's the only one. That's a very big hole in this narrative here, that these are violent protesters. It seems to me that if you wanted to talk about violence in any sort of honest sense, as we can discern here from the New York Times and CNN, the only violence we'd be looking at, the only major casualty that anyone will remember, was an Air Force veteran that was shot by Capitol Police.
Yeah, so, on that line, if we look at what it actually says there, it says she was shot, quote, as rioters tried to breach the House chamber, end quote. But they clearly weren't trying to breach the House chamber. I mean, there was a huge crowd. There were at least 20 people on the video footage just sort of standing right there. There were security guards in front of the doors. Like, there was no actual effort to breach the doors. So they're just lying out of their teeth right here about the events.
Right. So this is a... Yeah, so we can find seeds of them trying to rewrite things, but this is even your like major propaganda organs, they're supposed to push every little whim that you have coming out of the state chambers or whatever, aren't really going full bore into the narrative. I think you can say that there might be holes here and there. Also, by the way, if I drop out due to internet, you two just keep going on whatever subject we left up on. That seems to have been a problem with my Oklahoma infrastructure recently. But this is I just found this interesting yesterday when I was preparing for this, that even the major propaganda organs aren't going as far as they could with this narrative. So that's what I wanted to cover there. And before Charlie, especially, I think you would be very interested in the subject after. But before we moved on to the legal stuff that has come out of this, I think I wanted to highlight something that was rather insidious, that hasn't really been touched upon, as this has sort of been written into history. If you're going to look at any mainstream history book, or really any history book that tries to cover a period of time, they don't really try to pack in a lot of different occurrences or events within the same time frame. They'll typically be selective of what gets told about this specific year, or this specific couple of years, or this specific decade, or depending on the scope of the book. They'll filter out things into like the highlights. Basically how any history textbook works. Before this Capitol protest event in early 2021, there was the summer beforehand that was far more violent and far more destructive where you had property being burned down while raving bands of rioters just roamed the streets of multiple large metropolitan areas in the United States. I have a feeling that a sort of secondary utility of pushing this violence on January 6th narrative is kind of trying to memory hole the summer of love in 2020. I feel like this is sort of a way to take the spotlight out of anything that might have been happening during the election season and putting it squarely onto Heartland Americans, so that the history textbooks will remember them as these violent, raving lunatics, despite the fact that not a few months beforehand, the cities were being ransacked by raving lunatics of rioters that probably weren't the same demographic. I think that might be fair to say. I feel like I needed to get that into some sort of record just as time went on, because it's becoming increasingly clear that 2020 is not really being talked about with much detail. It's something that especially dissidents will just refer to offhand, but it doesn't have nearly the level of coverage that January 6th has. And part of that is just because, especially on our side, we have to respond to or look at what the mainstream is going with. They aren't hitting on 2020 summer riots. They're hitting on January 6th and using it against people. So that necessitates us to sort of talk about it. But that leaves 2020 summer riots by the wayside. So I wanted to mention that. Did you all have any comments on that subject?
No, I think that's been mentioned plenty polemically. I guess I would comment on the other two rallies of the year as well, which were, of course, the 2 million MAGA marches. So if we are going to, examine other protests that happened around the same time, we have the ones you just mentioned, and then the two MAGA marches, which, had no indication whatsoever that there would be anything particularly contentious or violent. I mean, one of the reasons I didn't go out of my way to go to the Capitol on January 6th is because I had gone to two other marches, and I was like, well, this is getting expensive. I've done my thing, done my part. There'll be plenty of people at this one. It's fine. I had no indication that something major was going to go down. I just kind of figured that I would be like a 3rd million MAGA march, basically, and that's it. So, we have examples of these left wing actual riots you're mentioning, and then we have really good examples of two prior pro-Trump rallies that were the most peaceful, mass protests in history, basically, to model things off of.
Right. So could you guys basically just give like a sort of overview for the people in the audience that might have forgotten or not really paid attention during that time? What were the people that were like there? What was the demographics? What was trying to be accomplished? What was the energy or the air surrounding the whole thing? Was it violent, contentious? Was it peaceful and positive, optimistic? You guys tell us. What was it like?
Felt a lot like Mardi Gras. I recall the two MAGA marches kind of blend together, but you're walking down Washington D.C. The place is pretty quiet. I think it was on the weekend, so not a lot of traffic, not a lot of people around. But eventually, you sort of come into the protest area, and it's basically just it looks like a giant crowd of Q boomers, basically. Not that everyone was old or something, but there's this plaza, like all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue, I believe. And it leads straight to the Congress or to the Capitol, and there was just this huge outdoor theater setup, basically, where you had music, you had people giving speeches, you had tons of people just waving flags around. It just felt like Mardi Gras, basically, except with a distinct political tinge to it. But it was more like a big party than anything, to be honest, which was a good vibe.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. Charlie and I were there for the first one together, and you had your usual suspects, like Alex Jones was there with a bullhorn, and the Proud Boys were milling around, and Nick Fuentes was there doing the same. It was a very kind of upbeat thing. It was marching from that plaza where everyone was talking to the Supreme Court, because I think that was still when the when all the states were bringing, was it an amicus brief? They filed one and everyone was signing on. I don't know if this was before or after Judge Roberts refused to hear it, but either way, you could stand at the top of the hill where the Supreme Court was and turn around, and all the way down this maybe mile-long street was just a sea of people packed shoulder to shoulder. And, this was when the media was calling these things COVID super spreader events, if you recall, and while at the same time saying that Black Lives Matter riots actually decreased the number of COVID cases. I believe the reasoning behind that was that the Black Lives Matter peaceful protests had people scared to leave their homes. So I don't really know how that squares, but either way, Antifa did show up for the Million MAGA March, but for the most part, the only violence there was, them literally throwing feces at people. Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah, this is the Colorado Sun claiming that
You gotta be kidding me.
claiming that the Black Lives Matter protests in Denver slowed the spread, which I think that this was about the point in time where the meme became that the spread was basically just anything that the regime didn't like, and that slowing the spread was anything that the regime liked. As if that wasn't obvious from the beginning. I think it was pretty clear for even normal people to see that whenever you start getting headlines like this. But this would be a question for both of you. Being especially a lot of people on our side like to remark at like the quality or the caliber of people in attendance for these different political movements. What was the average what was the average person like at these marches? Were they like respectable? Do you think they're middle class, lower class? Were they intelligent, dumb, dysgenic freaks, eugenic supermen? What were they like?
It was just mostly middle class white people, often, husband and wife and that sort of thing. So it was a good mix of people, and they were kind of, they weren't particularly dysgenic or anything like that. It was just just a crowd of Americans, basically. No particular distinctions that if you go to like a concert or something, you would basically see the same people.
Yeah,
It was a pretty solid cross section of middle class America. It was mostly, as Charlie said, white couples and East Asians. I saw a lot of people. I think it was the Epic Times. They were handing out flyers and things like that. But yeah, it was just, you kind of got the feeling that it was almost like a vacation for a lot of these people, or for the retirees, something exciting to do with their time.
Right. So this is not whenever we talk about riotous mobs ransacking major places of business or government or work and all this other stuff. Typically, what we have in mind are these sort of outcasted freaks, basically, that are just trying to loot things for material gain. And sounds like you guys are saying that this isn't really what the other marches seemed like, and so it's probably not what the great violent mob was composed of during January 6th. Would that be a reasonable extrapolation?
I'd say partially. The crowds were definitely of the same sort, but I know that due to the first 2 million MAGA marches, when Antifa, they were there during the day for the protests. They were standing on the other side of the police line, just hurling, their usual insults. And those were the dysgenic freaks, right? Like they were the younger, but clearly like very sickly, if not in physical health, and definitely sickly in mental health. But the first 2 million MAGA marches, they came out with, as I said before, hurling their own feces, and whenever they could get somebody who attended the marches alone, they would mob them and beat them. There were several instances of individual attendees being separated and attacked by the Antifa mobs. But so that means that on January 6th, there were some younger people there who were ready to do battle with with people from Antifa. I remember some people, on the various social media platforms talking about gearing up to fight Antifa after dark on the evening of January 6th, clearly expecting it to go the way that the other million MAGA marches went, where the march would occur, people would disperse, and then Antifa would start prowling the streets looking for victims.
Right, so this sounds just like organized self-defense, by the way you're describing it. It sounds like you don't want people left alone, because otherwise they're just going to be beaten by people who won't have the law brought down against them. So, it sounds like organized self-defense.
Definitely the MAGA marches, walking around, by yourself at night would have been a bad idea.
Right, so I feel like with that established, that the only people that you would expect to be violent and rampaging were on the other side, basically the counter-protesters, if you will. I think that might be the last detail we need. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to note about just the general facts or feeling or whatever else of the event before we moved on to the legality stuff?
Well, yeah, like you said, in terms of who looks like they're there to fight, I mean, the only people wearing like riot gear and armor and looking like they might have had weapons were the sort of Antifa lines at the MAGA marches, and I imagine same thing at January 6th. There wasn't like a reciprocal group of people during the MAGA march, confronting Antifa. The only people in front of Antifa were the who were similarly equipped were the police officers. So if anyone was there, like looking to cause violence, it's clearly the Antifa people.
Oh, there was one other group that shows up in gear to these sorts of things, but they're so inconsequential. Everybody seems to forget about them, except the left, who loves to wheel them out as a boogeyman every once in a while, and that's the Proud Boys. They're really good at standing back and standing by, as they say.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I did see the Proud Boys at the Million MAGA March, and during the day they were just sort of standing around in their own group. They weren't like trying to engage Antifa in the middle of the day or anything like that. So yeah, and they weren't equipped like Antifa were either during the day or night.
Right. So this so even that like secondary boogeyman to just the violent rampaging mob of January 6th sounds very lackluster and pathetic. That just seems to be the read that I get off of that. So, all right. With that, I think that we might switch just a little bit here. Now that we've gotten the basic facts out of the way, the generally just what happened, what has the narrative gotten wrong, past experience from other marches kind of to show that this whole thing might have been either allowed to happen or set up even. I think that we pretty well kind of shown that you can think that and not be a crazy person. In fact, you might be more sane than certainly anything coming out of Congress right now. However, none of this stuff is history. It is still in fact happening. I think it might do us some good to just look over a relevant law real quick. So for people that don't recognize, this is the 14th Amendment. We're going to be particularly looking at Section 3. This is the same amendment, by the way, that I've covered in various articles that you might hear every now and then. This is where you get the incorporation doctrine from. If you're wanting to know why the Supreme Court started to ban like public prayers in public schools, and why state Supreme Courts banned the Gideons distributing Bibles to people in public schools, the 14th Amendment is to blame for that, or at least how the courts have used the 14th Amendment. But it's coming back to us today for a completely different reason. This is one of the Reconstruction Amendments. In fact, it was the Reconstruction Amendment. The Southern states had to ratify this whole amendment in order to be readmitted to the Union after they were occupied, after previously not being occupied. So it's a very convoluted process here. Needless to say, this was very much forced onto the country, if you will, after quite a few states rejected it. Section 3 is what we're going to be paying attention to today. And it says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each House, remove such disability. So, most people, I think, given the narrative that's been pushed so incessantly in the last 3 years, can probably see why this is important, if you haven't caught in the recent developments in Maine and Colorado. From minute one, the charge has been insurrection, rebellion, coup d'etat by these relatively normal people who were led into Congress, led into the Capitol. That's been the charge, and that was very intentional. This wasn't just people being hyperbolic. This is a very specific penalty within the Constitution. It's been amended into it, and it basically disqualifies anyone from holding any real office or any real power, at least officially. So, any comment, you guys, just on this here, the 14th Amendment, before we move on?
I mean,
Well,
oh, go ahead, Charlie.
Oh, you go first.
I was just going to say this is the beauty of the living Constitution, right? These things were made for a very specific purpose, but now they can be interpreted to mean pretty much anything.
Right, and this is very strange as well, because you look at United States history, and even mainstream textbooks, the ones that aren't written by literal communists and socialists like Foner, for instance, these books will usually recognize that these amendments that weren't just abolishing slavery, so 13th disregarded, but the 14th Amendment, and then the other laws, the Reconstruction laws, the various enforcement acts, and whatever else, tended to go a bit too far. Even the mainstream will recognize this. Obviously, in our circle of talking about American history, we know that a little too far is probably a bit of a euphemism. But this is a law that, if it were enacted in the last century, would be basically seen as a reason to purge. Because it's not just anyone that actually did engage in insurrection and rebellion against the great and glorious state. This also applies to anyone that gave comfort or aid to any enemy of the great and glorious state. So very wide-reaching, very sort of relaxed in how it's being applied, and this was intentional at the time. This was a penalty that was being enforced on half of the country that supposedly also hadn't seceded. But also, if you did secede, then you are basically not going to hold any political office in the country again, unless such is removed by Congress. So this is also not a permanent charge against you. This is something that is very much just legal fiat. Rebellion and insurrection is a grave and serious crime that may or may not have happened, depending on how Congress votes. So, I personally, if you can't tell, I don't really like this 14th Amendment. Most people on the right actually don't really like the 14th Amendment. This is also where you get the birthright citizenship stuff that's kind of ruined the country. But, Charlie, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yes, so regarding this Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, I wanted to ask some relevant questions. So, can you tell me, Ryan, which ballots the Colorado Supreme Court and Maine's Secretary of State are trying to remove President Trump from?
If I remember correctly, these are the Republican Party primary ballots, are they not?
That is correct. Is the nominee of the Republican Party a civil or military office under the United States?
I think we would consider that a private organization and not a governmental office.
I think you are correct. But who cares? F it, let's just pretend that this law just does what we want.
Right. As a great attorney told us, Charlemagne, I think the audience might get some understanding out of this. This is a classic mistake that non-lawyers make, in assuming that the law is not just anything but selectively applying power. So, yeah, as Charlemagne was pointing out there, for anyone that has been looking at any recent events, Colorado and Maine have been basically using this Section 3 as a pretense to ban who can run under a private organization's banner. So this is a very strange thing to specifically use the 14th Amendment. You have had states in the past regulate who can run on the general ballot. This has happened before, and you have various laws in different states and whatnot, but you haven't seen really the 14th Amendment used in this way to regulate the Republican Party or whatever caucus is present in Colorado and Maine that would be representing the Republicans. This is very strange. The implication here, I guess, is the Republican Party is just part of the U.S. government.
Well, I think that's how most people understand it, and most people probably wouldn't even ask those questions for that reason. But yes, in fact, the Republican Party or any political party is not actually part of the government. They are private organizations. I don't see any way you can actually read this and come to the conclusion that it's illegal for a political party to nominate what's effectively a lame duck candidate. I mean, if the party wants to nominate someone who's not qualified to run, maybe that could be a mistake, but it seems like it doesn't fall under the purview of this amendment.
Right, and it's once again worth pointing out, we haven't had. It's not like the parties have both selected their nominees, and you've had states saying we're going to keep this specific person off of the general ballot whenever our state goes to vote. That has happened before. California kept the America Party off of the 1968 ballot just because they have specific laws banning parties from having the word America or something like that in their names. So you have to basically be a party without the name America or American or USA or whatever to be on the ballot in California, at least at that time. That's happened before. And I think you can make a pretty convincing argument that states should basically be able to, if you wanted to be a decentralizer, states should be able to regulate who is and isn't on the ballot. We could definitely see this working in our favor, ideally. However, we don't live in the ideal, and we don't live in a decentralized country, certainly not in the last 150 years. We don't live in this liberal ideal. So what's happening here? Well, what we're seeing is Colorado and Maine are regulating the Republican Party for who they can potentially even nominate by their systems. And they're using that to ban the opposition parties. I think that's about as clear cut as you can phrase it. So, anything else on the 14th Amendment, gentlemen, before we move on to this document that we're going to be going through?
I just think the first sentence of Section 4 is funny, although it's not actually relevant here.
Oh, right. Yeah. So people can. I would encourage genuinely anyone in this audience to look through the 14th Amendment. You can kind of see why this is generally just a terrible addition to the legal system. If you were just be idealistic for a second, you can see basically you can see that there's a lot of things that should be used here that probably aren't used in the way that they were intended to be, and then you have other things that were then concocted within the same amendment to get the same idea across. So we'll leave that for another time, though. We'll instead move on to this document, which is from was it Maine Secretary of State? Is that specifically who this was from?
Yes.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, so we will pull this up, allow, and go back to this setting. So what we have here, this is page 23 of the report filed by Maine Secretary of State. So Charlemagne, you're the one that introduced me to this. Could you walk us through this a little bit?
Sure. So this is pretty similar to Colorado Supreme Court's document or decision, rather, deciding to ban Trump from their Republican primary ballot. And this is pretty much following the same vein and sort of the structure. So sort of skipping to the relevant parts, which you have on screen. The third point in basically the reasoning behind this woman disallowing Trump for being on Maine's ballot unilaterally, I should add, without the chance to actually, defend himself, is that, the record demonstrates that the events of January 6, 2021 were an insurrection. The parties do not meaningfully dispute the events of January 6, 2021. I'm not really sure exactly what that's implying.
I think I think that's just a legal procedure saying they don't need to go get the events determined at a court, because that is something you can do. If two parties disagree on events, you can basically get a ruling on what fact sheet you are working with.
Yeah, and this seems to be basically her ruling on, I guess, lawsuits brought by three separate parties that are established earlier in the ruling. So I guess she might be referring to all parties involved, the three separate lawsuits, and her own self as one of the parties.
So basically, this is a declaration that they don't dispute what physically happened, that people entered the Capitol building or whatever else. The interpretations, however, are not agreed upon.
Right. Well,
Yeah,
that's
I
what they're
mean,
using. They're claiming that their interpretation is the only valid one. So if you don't dispute the physical events, then you automatically agree with their interpretation.
And that's just an ironclad argument. I don't know how I would ever argue against that.
yeah, I mean, it just rests on, like, this whole thing rests on two major axioms. First, that the election was legitimate, and second, that the people there, the crowd there, was specifically there to do insurrection. All the rest of the argument, like, pretty much rests on that.
Right. So why don't we just read a little bit farther into this paragraph that we had on screen that Charlemagne started reading. It says multiple government reports that the Rosen challengers entered into evidence confirmed that a large group of people violently attacked the Capitol with the intent of preventing the certification of the presidential election. This resulted in a lockdown of the Capitol complex, an evacuation of the vice president and the congressional leaders, an interruption of official House and Senate proceedings, and multiple deaths and injuries. So already we have basically a litany of everything that we just went through and showed was either overblown, self-inflicted, or just flat out false. So this fact sheet that they're working with here, I don't even think that this is factually correct. That you had multiple deaths and injuries that were a result of anything that happened at the Capitol. Really, you had one death that was a result of the things that happened at the Capitol, and it was a protester being shot by the police. Is that what they're going with here? This is an insurrection because the police had to shoot someone who was basically just standing at the doorway.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, like, the axiom is that it was an insurrection, and now they're just kind of, what are they doing? They're searching for the evidence to bolster their own conclusion. And like we were saying before, with, like, who died, they don't even need to get into the details, because for the sake of this argument, anybody who died that was in any way involved was a direct result of the protests, even if, as we established, some of them died from a stroke or a drug overdose.
Right, yeah. So I guess what this means is that if ever you go to a public protest, if we were to be logically consistent here, I know this is an exercise in futility, doesn't matter, power is just going to do what power wants to. Well, let's just show how stupid this is. I feel like they could have crafted a better narrative if they were to really bring the hammer down here. I feel like they're being sloppy and lazy. I guess the implication here is that if you ever go to a protest at a government building, while that government building has some sort of a party or group in session, and someone just, like, has a heart attack or a stroke while at this protest, I guess the implication here is that that's a rebellion or an insurrection, because you were clearly you're trying to interrupt the official proceedings of the legal system, and that person died as a result of being there. So violence, death, and interruption, rebellion.
Right. It should also be noted again, the Congress chose to end the proceedings and move. They weren't actually disrupted in any direct way. So yeah, I mean, basically it's saying that no matter how obliquely, if your actions can be linked in some chain of events to a decision to stop a government proceeding, then that means it's an insurrection.
Yeah, and
Right.
this kind of puts them into interesting, I guess, frame, because as we were talking about before with the events of 2020 and 2021, if we recall, I believe it was either Portland or Seattle where Antifa and Black Lives Matter were literally sieging a courthouse for, what was it, weeks? And I'm sure that people got injured during that, although I'm not entirely sure if anyone died. Since we know from various networks, network maps, that the governor of Portland is involved with the Antifa. Like, if they establish that, just being aware of something occurring and that occurrence being violence on the part of people who support you or who you support being enough to constitute insurrection, they're opening their own operatives and missions up to scrutiny under this.
Right, and I would just like to highlight something else on this document, because they have this weaseling right here at this last sentence in this block quote. They say the attack resulted in assaults on at least 174 police officers, including 114 Capitol Police and 60 DC Metropolitan Police Department officers. These events led to at least 7 deaths and caused about $2.7 billion in estimated costs. So let's just take a look here. Remember the reports that we had earlier from the New York Times and CNN. Basically everything on there, once again, except for Ashley Babbitt being shot by the police, were people just having strokes or heart attacks or committing suicide after the fact, very, very cleanly and non-pressured, I'm sure. Completely, basically, just the only relation that they have to these events are they happened in the same time vicinity. This is very much diluting the word result. I would have to say this is I think this could say coincided. It would be a better word.
Yeah, like you could even say coincidentally, but I do like how they mention this 174 police officers. They're just basically saying, yeah, this is how many police officers were there.
Yeah, right. So this is basically police were there and violence happened. So therefore, these police officers endured an attack.
Right, and of course, the attack is like they got shoved or something for most of these people,
or just claiming that it happened. Like,
Yeah.
this is the thing as well. What actual procedure do we have to ensure that this is truthful? That these reports are
Well,
truthful?
look, it's a United States government accountability report. How could it not be truthful?
Yeah, it's the classic. The government has reviewed itself and determined that it is engaged in no wrongdoing. Yeah, so I'm incensed on this, and this is for anyone that wants to know, this is page 23 of the Maine Secretary of State report. This is the grounds that they are using that this was a violent insurrection. Everything that we just went through in that first hour of the stream. This is what the state is using as basically a means to formalize and make explicit a one-party state.
Yeah, if you want to, the more interesting part though is on page 26, part 4. Same goes for the Colorado case. This is the part that really matters because actually, whether or not there was an insurrection, as such, isn't directly relevant to what's happening. The question is whether or not President Trump himself engaged in the insurrection. That's the link they need to make, and this is actually even more infuriating. You can see right here, she basically writes that in order to enforce the 14th Amendment in this manner, the person doesn't actually have to have been convicted of anything. She could just assess the situation basically and determine that the insurrection happened.
Now,
and then, of course, yeah, go ahead.
If we're being perfectly honest on that point, I think that's exactly how the 14th Amendment was meant to be used at the time that it was ratified.
Fair point. And then, yeah, they go into the definition, but on page 28, we get to the sort of meat of the argument and not this like silly dictionary stuff about what an insurrection and what engaging means. But yeah, so to page 28, sort of at the top, it's like they're linking the idea that so like before the 2020 election, Mr. Trump sowed doubt in its legitimacy. Like, okay, I mean, we're basically saying she's basically linking this to the idea of inciting an insurrection. And he called the election rigged. Let's see, on
He
social
he
media.
blamed
He
it
claimed
on
there's fraud. So it's like, are
to
you
give.
not allowed to do this? Like, you're just not allowed to.
Well, I mean, it. I'm just they leave out the part where Trump had the FBI and multiple other intelligence agencies trying to investigate the 2016 election for its influence of Russian hackers. But that's the wrong side, of course. This is basic but whataboutism from me here. But once again, this is I find this outrageous just because I can't unsee the amount of projection that goes into literally every facet of our current government. Uh, they spent years and years lambasting like relatively normal people all the way up to the president himself for specifically colluding and engaging in treasonous activities and overturning or not overturning, but rigging elections and whatever else away from Clinton. And now suddenly the whole thing is reversed. They're being accused of insurrection and for casting doubt on how the election went.
Well, yeah, again, it just comes back to their priors, right? Whatever we do is right. If you disagree with it, you're engaged in some form of illegitimate action or speech. And throughout this entire thing, the Secretary of State keeps referencing this Professor Magliocca, Gerard Magliocca, and he's a constitutional lawyer, but he seems to be very much into this idea that the Constitution is a living document, which again means whoever has power to interpret will just interpret it the way that they want to. So kind of it's even more glaring that the Secretary of State bases her decision on this guy who's basically like, yeah, it can mean whatever you want it to mean.
Well, just real quick here to the earlier thing that you said. It's not just that whatever they do is good, and if you do the same thing, it's bad because of who's doing it. It's much stupider and much more glaring than that. It's whatever they are doing is very good, and you're doing the opposite, or you're doing that thing as well, and it's bad. But it's the basically, I'm just in awe at how we have an entire governmental system of tens of thousands of people employed in it, working around the clock to basically fabricate these narratives that whatever they're doing, you're actually doing it, and it's absolutely evil, and you basically need to be eliminated out of society. I'm in awe that the structure is in place right now. It really is something out of a dystopia. But I'll stop being a boomer basically, and we can move on to what's in front of us.
Yeah, so at the bottom of this page, basically what happens is some other person. I mean, it kind of reads like a threat about this unnamed official. I assume they're actually named in the case referenced, but they're basically declaring that Trump is violent and someone is going to get killed because of his rhetoric. And apparently, someone else declaring that you're dangerous is evidence against you now. Okay. And then, of course, on page 29 at the top, the Colorado case also had a similar line where they just sort of claim that Trump was quote unquote fully aware of how his words and deeds bred violence and threatened war. Because like someone told him there could be violence. Also, someone told him that Antifa and a few other people got in a fight at like a MAGA march. He's quote unquote fully aware of all of the violence or whatever.
Right, and this is an interesting extrapolation, but it is absolutely mind-boggling. Antifa causes violence, therefore Trump is aware that his words and actions cause violence.
Yeah, well, once again, it's similar to what we had said before, where no matter what had happened, no matter obliquely, if it can be in some sort of if it coincided basically with what you're doing, then it means you're guilty and connected to it. I mean, it's like the broadest possible concept of a conspiracy that could be described. And of course, they go into similar stuff towards on the rest of the page. Like basically the idea that questioning the election results is illegal. Interestingly, on page 30, they mention that he implored Trump implored Vice President Pence to do legal things, basically.
Yeah,
And that's all.
yeah. Trump employed the vice president to do something which was well within his legal rights as the vice president. Therefore, he was engaging in illegal insurrection by disrupting legal procedures. It's a wonderful argument, and to be perfectly honest, the reason that I care so much about this, and the reason that this really annoys me to the extent that it does, and this is definitely a flaw on my part, is just because of how sloppy and unreasonable it is. If it was a well-crafted narrative that they were pushing, like something you might have found during the Obama era, where basically everything that happened was something evil against blacks and whatever other community that you had as the stalking horse that day, and they had this well-crafted, drawn-out like novel associated with each infringement against them that required this new law to be passed or whatever. That was a lot more effort. It was a lot harder to argue against. There was some sort of struggle there. It looked like time had been put into it. It looked like might have been a brain behind it. This stuff is really, you mentioned it earlier, Charlie. This is really just these things coincided. This one person said an offhand comment. Therefore, you are fully responsible for anything that's happened, Mr. President. It feels like this was stitched together in an afternoon.
Yeah, and of course go ahead.
Oh, I totally feel that. It's like insulting. Like if these are the people who rule over us and they're, the enemies of the American people and they're doing all this ridiculous stuff, it's almost insulting that they're this incompetent, because it's like, well, if they're this incompetent and still have this much power, like what are we doing wrong?
Right. I think that might be perhaps a sign that the current governmental system is just ruling by the bayonet. I sincerely do not believe that if they did not have power, there's zero legitimacy, physical power, force. If they didn't have that, there's zero legitimacy left in them. That I think they would be gone overnight. That this is the level of incompetence that they're at.
And in terms of their bombshell, the Colorado Supreme Court also used this. They cite that the crowd used the word fight, and President Trump used the word fight, therefore violence. Even though obviously the word is used not in that context. Like you can fight for, I don't know, fighting for something, fighting for a cause doesn't necessarily mean physical violence. Like you can fight to, I don't know, defeat another sports team or something, right? Like it's not it doesn't imply like an actual attack. That's just totally, it's not even a weird, I don't even want to call it like a metaphorical use, because it's just common parlance of the way of use the word fight.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's literally just like
in politics, right? It's like go to the polls.
It's literally like a second definition if you find it in the dictionary. But since you're talking about metaphors, let's look up here. Mr. Trump retweeted a post from an organizer of the January 6th march for Trump stating, "The cavalry, I guess a typo, is coming, Mr. President," calling it a great honor. Clearly, this metaphor, this grammatical or literary device being used is very literal and implies that armed horsemen are going to come and fight for the president. I could not think of better legal evidence to prove that Trump engaged in an insurrection. He retweeted a metaphor from a protest organizer. Brilliant.
The weird thing is too, on page 31, they actually start citing that Trump tweeted to support law enforcement and stay peaceful, but they claim that because he didn't condemn the actions of the rioters, that's not good enough. So it's basically like there's really nothing that he could actually do that would disconnect him from the connections they're trying to make. Like apparently telling people not to be violent and to stay peaceful is insufficient. So it really shows like no matter what Trump actually did, the plans they had for what they wanted to happen that day were going to go down, and they were going to accuse him of inciting the events. I mean, it's like they literally put evidence against their own case in this document, but then claim it's actually evidence for it.
This is go on.
It's their like kind of schizophrenic need for their opponents to like admit that they're wrong. Like it's not enough that he, like you were saying, to call for peace and like, don't do this. He also has to tell everyone what bad boys they're being and how disappointed he is in them.
The court would like to use the evidence that the defendant has not yet submitted his apology as evidence that he has committed the crime. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
this is I'm so just looking here. This is perhaps the world's laziest catch-22. Either Trump doesn't say anything, or either Trump uses force to ensure that people are nonviolent, in which case he's engaging in insurrection because he used violent force at this protest, or he doesn't use force and he tells people to stay nonviolent, in which case he's engaging in insurrection because he didn't do anything physical to keep people nonviolent. This feels ham-fisted.
Now, there's an interesting line in here as well about him not making an effort to mobilize federal law enforcement with a National Guard. Didn't he actually intend to do that, but it was blocked, if I recall?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go on.
If I recall correctly, the mayor blocked the request for the National Guard. In fact, which is very interesting because after the events, she declared a state of emergency. I think mobilized them anyway.
Yeah, so this is just a bizarre, actually just outright lie in this document where, for one, he doesn't have jurisdiction over the Capitol Police, and then two, he did attempt to have the National Guard available, and that was actually blocked. So this is just an outright lie in the document.
Which page is that on?
It's
it
on
right
31. It's right
okay,
there. Yeah. Mr. Trump learned the Capitol was under attack, yet he made no effort to mobilize the law enforcement or National Guard. I mean, he attempted to mobilize the National Guard preemptively before anything even happened and was blocked. I mean, it's also like you don't just press a button and mobilize the Guard, right? Especially while these events are happening. So I mean, the idea that like at one o'clock he didn't know things, and then at 1:21 he did know things, and he should have immediately like pressed the magical mobilize the Guard button and like teleported them to the Capitol Hill. Like that's just not how things work. But I guess because he didn't magically teleport law enforcement exactly where they needed to go, that he's guilty.
This is interesting as well. Look at this very lazy connection that they tried to put here. Instead, an hour later and minutes after the Capitol building itself had been breached, Mr. Trump tweeted that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect the country, as if he was supposed to know the timing of that. This omniscient and omnipresent Mr. Trump was supposed to know that like a couple of minutes ago the Capitol had been breached, and he was going to he was clearly tweeting here to egg on the people and make them violent inside the Capitol. This is inane.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like that the whole case is built upon this basic premise of omniscience on Trump's part.
Yeah,
omniscience and omnipresence. This is brilliant.
I mean, it's nice to see that the Maine Secretary of State has the same like conception of the president's power as the average American.
Right, yeah, or as like the average Christian does of God. Like, we're attributing divine attributes to Trump here to make this case go through. He was omnipresent and omniscient. Is he omnipotent next?
I mean, the biggest issue... I'm sorry. The biggest issue is that this whole thing is logically consistent within the, to borrow a phrase, within the bounded rationality of the people making this case. The axiom is that the election was completely legitimate. Everybody knows this, and if you deny it, you're just lying. So they just move forward from that. So like this is just a logical extension of them having bad axioms.
Right. This is brilliant, and where you can either admit that you did it, in which case that's proof that you did it, or you can deny that you did it, in which case that's proof that you did it. I don't, just from what cursory knowledge I have of Reconstruction, I'm sure that perhaps Bagby or Sandbach, our good friends, might be able to correct me. I think that at least in Reconstruction, they just would have been more explicit and said, yeah, we don't like you, and so we're going to strip you of your rights and imprison you. I don't think they would have gone through this extremely, this knuckle-dragging crusade here that's in this document. I don't think they would have had this insult that would have been attached to them.
I was laughing at, if you go to the next page, 32, can you just read the first full paragraph at the top, toward the top of the page.
Starting with I likewise.
No, Mr. Trump.
Right here.
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Trump's occasional requests that the rioters be peaceful and and support law enforcement do not immunize his actions. A brief call to obey the law does not erase conduct over the course of months, culminating in a speech on the ellipse. The weight of the evidence makes clear that Mr. Trump was aware of the tinder laid by his multi-month effort to delegitimize a democratic election and then chose to light a match. So the lighting of the match is showing up and then telling people to be peaceful. This is an airtight argument.
Yeah, it's literally telling people to obey the law doesn't count because reasons.
Right, yeah. So the one direct piece of evidence that would be very clear in showing that this whole case is idiotic in the extreme is actually just doesn't count, or potentially is proof against Trump. I don't know what I was expecting, but I'll be perfectly honest. I did not continue reading basically the summary that's given by the Maine Secretary of State on these last few pages. So I didn't actually come across this. This is, I don't know what I was expecting, but it's somehow worse in that it tries to seem managerial and professional, but I genuinely think like any fifth grader could see the problems with this official court document.
She's the perfect longhouse HR lady, right? Like, oh, he knew what he did wrong. He knew that this was going to happen. It doesn't matter what he knew it. I know he knew it. Like, it's just... It's the Secretary of State having a woman moment.
Yes. And once again, that paragraph sort of it does this thing where everything that happened prior is like retroactively part of this case, even though you have to remember that before January 6th, there was no indication that like something was going to happen, right? So they're sort of retroactively applying that Trump was building this sort of, again, as it says, multi-month effort. He was sort of building this conspiracy in order to do an insurrection, but that's all just retroactively reinterpreting the events. Everything he had done up until that point was just, lawsuits. Send his people to state hearings, this sort of thing, right?
Well, Charlemagne, as we've established in this document, as is fact, Trump is omniscient. He knew beforehand what would happen in the future, and then that's basically just proof of his guilt beforehand. He saw into the future and saw what his insightful actions were going to inspire. I mean, he's guilty of not stopping the thoughts as they occurred to him. Is there a part of this document that argues that? I wouldn't be surprised.
We should also note this brilliant lady, destroys the First Amendment with facts and logics in the body of text you have on screen right now. This is actually the most infuriating part to me. Do you want to read that?
Starting at which sentence?
The events.
Okay.
Of January.
The events of January 6th, 2021 notwithstanding, Mr. Trump also claims that he cannot be disqualified from the presidency for his conduct because his public statements and speeches are protected by the First Amendment. But Mr. Trump cites no precedent, and I am unaware of any that permits the First Amendment to override a qualification for public office. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is not a criminal penalty, as in Federal Election Commission versus Wisconsin Right to Life Incorporated, nor is it a punishment. Describing historical understanding of Section 3. It is simply a qualification for office. So, this is sort of like the same argument that gets used in public schools, in that if you want to, a qualification for being a public school teacher is that you cannot make a biased statement about religion. So you can only talk about religion in a non-biased and neutral way, I believe, is the legal precedent. Who gets to determine what is non-biased in the legal precedent? Well, the people in power, of course. Unless you're the president, in which case, if you're the president, you can't actually make any sort of claim that I guess could even potentially incite a potential violent act by some random person, because that's insurrection.
Yeah, and what it basically reads is that, as long as we're not applying criminal penalties to you, we can regulate your speech as much as we want, so long as it's like just limiting what you're able to do. Here it's limiting your ability to run for office. Like you said, limiting public school teachers. Like apparently, the First Amendment doesn't say what it says, and the government can abridge your speech as much as it wants in an indirect manner by disqualifying you from doing things, as long as it's not directly applying criminal penalties for a statement. Then they can limit your speech in any other way. Obviously, that's how the First Amendment was intended. Like, am I right?
Right, and this is a brilliant consequence of incorporation, I think, and this is where the Supreme Court basically takes the first few amendments of the Bill of Rights, the single digit ones, and says that actually these aren't applying to the federal government; they apply to literally everything.
Yeah.
So if you read the First Amendment, you'll see Congress shall make no law establishing a religion abridging the freedom of speech or the assembly or the press or whatever else. Clearly, if you were to give like an honest reading of the First Amendment, it's a restriction upon Congress. But we've since incorporated the First Amendment to mean basically anything you wanted to, so long as it fits within this sort of secular atheist post-war consensus about mean speech is bad, talking about religion in a sympathetic manner in public schools is bad. Going to church during school hours is literally illegal in some states. I believe that would be Illinois was the one that established that precedent. But if you're the president, who's doing the regulation here? I'm trying to find out what is the legal body regulating the president's speech here? Is it the courts? The judiciary regulates what the president can say?
Well, it's kind of like that stupid lefty meme that you see floating around where they say freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequence, which is like what does freedom mean then? If you don't have the freedom to do something without incurring a consequence or a cost, what does that mean?
Well, and generally, you would say it would be a governmental consequence is the thing that you're specifically being protected from, but that doesn't even fit within the leftist framework. To the leftist, freedom means freedom from any and all consequence at all. So magically, they've got this furcated definition of freedom that means whatever they want it to, as with everything else. Reality does not register clearly to any of these people, no matter how mainstream or in what high office they are, or if they're just some Antifa drag on the internet. It's pretty clear that these are just like these are basically just worms. They scrounge around where the power is. They're grubs inside of like some moldy, dying institution because it has these little last droplets of power that they can scrounge up and use as the whole thing just crumbles apart.
Yeah, and then of course, secondarily, they also disbar him from, or disqualify him rather from running because of the claim that he incited lawless action, which is pictured there as well. I mean, again, this is like the flimsiest part of the entire argument. Actually, it's the linchpin of the entire thing is that Trump incited the insurrection, and all they really have to indicate that that's not just some sort of circumstantial, dubious connection is the fact that he used the word fight in his speech in that one particular quote. Everything else is just sort of like the idea that this general conspiracy to delegitimize the election was like part of the incitement to violence. As I said, he orchestrated violence against the government.
Right. Let's read out this first sentence here. There's quite the word here that I don't think that even someone sympathetic to their side would say has been proven, unless they are just trying to, if we were to give an honest reading from their perspective. It says, additionally, because I conclude that Mr. Trump intended to incite lawless action, his speech is unprotected by the First Amendment. Right. Has anything in here actually been construed to show that he intended it, other than the weird omniscient passages that we had beforehand, where he was magically tweeting it within like 90 seconds of the Capitol being opened up by the Capitol Police? Like, is that all they have to show that he intended? He planned this out beforehand. He knew how this was going to unfold. He had met with the Capitol Police beforehand and told them to open up the building. Do we get any sort of like construment for that?
Right. I mean, proving intent is the linchpin of the law in many cases, and as far as I can tell, there's been no real demonstration of intent here. Certainly not as it would normally be done in like an actual court. I mean, again, this is a unilateral document. It's not actually a judicial document. She's simply deciding, as she says, I have concluded his intent. So she just concluded his intent. there's no actual opportunity other than the judicial system within Maine to actually argue with any of her claims. And of course, we get a nice democracy is sacred right there in the conclusion, which I don't know what that means. If something's not holy, I don't whatever.
Before we move on to the conclusion, I would just like to point out this absolutely fantastic legal system that we have here. Principles of free speech do not override the clear command of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So what we're saying there is the 14th Amendment supersedes all other amendments, because we're not operating off of some vague principle of free speech in the legal code. We're operating off of an amendment, especially now that it's been incorporated after the 1940s through 1960s. So we have here a fantastic declaration. Not that they aren't contradictory or they're in concord or they all are within the same common body of legal precedents or whatever. No, principles of free speech do not override the clear command of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is the superior amendment. It is Amendment 1, basically, in the New Order.
Well, she also says she doesn't even cite the First Amendment in that sentence. She just cites principles, whatever that means.
Right, and I think that's pretty clear in this paragraph where she's talking about the First Amendment as it relates to free speech. She is just reducing that to, it's just principles of free speech, these ethereal concepts that we haven't really clarified that much, unless we're using that for my case, in which case they're perfectly clear. But, these principles of free speech, these things floating around in the ether, they don't actually supersede this brilliant 14th Amendment, this one section from it. This is brilliant, really. If I wanted to make an argument for the hierarchies of the amendments, I guess I'm just going to have to ask the Maine Secretary of State, because this is I don't know if this was unintentional or if this was I don't really know what the intention is here. I guess it's just to show that this case number 1 rests upon the 14th Amendment. Anything else there can just can pound sand if it goes against it. This is fantastic. So, you want to move on to the conclusion then?
Yeah, if you want. I mean, it's mostly just a bunch of nonsense.
I find the diction hilarious here, just scanning over it. As Not Me, Not You said earlier in the stream, HR managerial parlance is in use here. I do not reach this conclusion lightly. Democracy is sacred, and the highest court of this state has repeatedly recognized that no right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election of those who make the laws under which, as good citizens, we must live. I am mindful that no Secretary of State has ever deprived a presidential candidate of ballot access based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I am also mindful, however, that no presidential candidate has ever before engaged in insurrection. The oath I swore to uphold the Constitution comes first above all, and my duty under Maine's election laws, when presented with Section 336 challenge, is to ensure that candidates who appear on the primary ballot are qualified for the office they seek. So this is brilliant, because she's making this. This is basically how any high school class will tell you to write, and it's absolutely terrible advice. They'll say is that if you have a weak point in your argument or your writing or something, turn it into a positive, make it daring or bold, or actually show how it proves your case, regardless of any sort of facts or honesty. It's basically, this is like high school writing advice that tells you to eschew logic to make your case to get a good grade. This is what.
It's bizarre that this is even in this document, which is a legal document. She's writing this sort of flowery conclusion about her role in government. It's what are you doing? This
not only she's basically just saying, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. No person has ever done this before, because it is so clearly idiotic that no one would have attempted to risk their legal career on doing this. This is even for the people that support this, I don't think you could say this is the best way to go about it. I have a feeling that there would probably be some grimaces and some angry words being exchanged behind doors right now, just because of how stupid this is. Typically, if you're some status quo establishment suit, and you're talking to people behind closed doors, and you want to get someone taken care of electorally, you're not going to write a document like this and drag it through the court systems. You're going to use some other means, and I guess that perhaps the the great glass ceiling needed to be shattered. The first woman to ever disbar a president on grounds of the 14th Amendment from a primary ballot, I guess, needed to be broken. That's a good glass ceiling to shatter.
Yeah, and one wonders with like all these super flimsy arguments and ridiculous just unilateral decisions, are they like trying, and they're doing it this early, are they trying to basically pave the way for more robust arguments to come out as the decisions come down? Or is it going to be like the election fortification, where they did a bunch of illegal stuff to harvest ballots that was only ruled unconstitutional or illegal after the election had already taken place?
I think it's more the former. Like, if you look at the last page, she does the same exact thing that Colorado did, where they kick the can down the road. So she makes the decision, but then immediately suspends it for someone else to have to deal with the problem, basically. I think they're trying to build up their case by, I think the primary ballots are sort of the test run, because it doesn't matter, right? Like, the primary ballot, it's like, if you keep them off, great. If you fail, well, there's still the actual election. So I think they're sort of using this opportunity to iron out all the flaws in any of their cases. And of course, also, since the states are, republic, there might be a case for individual states to remove the president from the ballot without even necessarily appealing to Section 3. I don't know of any, but we'll see. But yeah, I think it's the former.
I'm still kind of, this is. So how if you ask like ChatGPT or any other AI system to write like an essay for you, it has a specific structure that it follows, where it's basically, it uses the exact same syntax, it uses the exact same like sentence 1 in the conclusion will make this point, sentence 2 in the conclusion will make this point. That's literally what this conclusion is, and that's not because this is written by AI. I don't think necessarily. It's because this is so undeveloped. If you read like some older court documents, even from the ancient years of like the 1960s or 70s, times that some of the older people in our spheres might actually remember, this is not how they sound. The diction here is bland. Like, it's not even official sounding. It sounds managerial. This sounds like a corporate report that you would receive. And look at, once again, I want to hammer home this point. A high schooler wrote this. This is basically the level it's at. I am so daring because I am the first person to invoke Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I know that this is a controversial thing. I don't take this decision lightly. So look at this great thing that I've done. This is, I don't have anything more to say. I'm just going to keep rambling about that. That's complete. That's living in my head rent-free for at least another couple hours.
Yeah, the absolute lack of humility and the self-aggrandizement. It's so unlike a woman politician to do something like that.
Man. So did we miss anything from here? Because this is Is there anything worse in here?
No, this is the end. She uses the word mindful twice there, which is this horrible corporate HR word as well.
Yeah.
Clearly you read this and you look at her interviews. Basically, like, a lot of what's going on here with the whole attack on Trump is just like this sort of release of sexual tension in middle-aged women. She just gets off on this. Right, that's like 50% of the entire frenzy against President Trump, I think, is just sexual tension in middle-aged women. Being released.
Yeah, I'd laugh, but that's pretty legit.
I'm not even joking. It's I'm being funny, right? But I'm also 100% serious about that point.
What's the thing that our good friend Red Hawk says? If all these women online had like a actual fulfillment and healthy lives privately, sort of euphemizing here, they wouldn't be online. I have a feeling the same exact principle applies to being the Secretary of State for a state in the country. Like, something has gone wrong personally for this to be the state of affairs.
Yeah, one wonders, does this woman have children?
That might be a good question, actually. Does she? Yeah, might be.
Idea. I can look it up real quick.
Yeah. So if one of you guys want to do that, because I've seen something here as well. This whole conclusion is flabbergasting. So, um, the events of January 6, 2021 were unprecedented and tragic. They were an attack not only upon the Capitol and government officials, but also an attack on the rule of law. Once again, the only actual casualty that was a direct result of anything that happened was a protester getting shot at the door of the Capitol. So, this is... I don't know. Maybe anyone that can read and speak Russian or any Cyrillic alphabet, maybe someone can inform us. But were Russian show trials this blatant and how they would just reverse facts just in front of people? Did they at least try to forge evidence, make it seem plausible, or were they this explicit? That would be something I would like to know. Charlie, what were you saying?
Oh, I was just grimacing at her husband. I found he looks like Richard Hanania, basically. I found like a picture, and he looks exactly like you'd expect. So apparently, she's 48, married in 2012. So married this guy at 38. I mean, we can kind of see the case.
Okay,
here.
yeah. Many such cases.
The personal life on her Wikipedia just says that she lives with her husband, and I'm pretty sure we can conclude from that. No, she doesn't have any children, which makes a lot of sense. Women in politics seldom do, it seems like.
Yeah, I'm personally in shock at this stunning new revelation that we've received here. So, did you all have anything else that you wanted to go over here before I just pull up this? Okay, Charlie,
No, do it.
Yeah, hold on. What happened? Hold on. Link is not working for me. Give me a second. But yeah, is there anything that you wanted to go over in this document?
I think we've hit it all pretty hard. I mean, it's just a ridiculous, like, oh, here's an opportunity for me to swing some power around, and I know that my side's not going to call me on my bullshit. So
yeah, this is yeah. So this is the main Secretary of State and her husband.
Yeah, that seems about right. Yeah.
Can we do we even need to say that we need a physiognomy check? I think that we can just we can infer now. I think that we all know. We all implicitly do the check whenever we see these people. So, like look at this. I think
image
this
speaks for itself.
Yeah, I think this is literally the deceitful chin from that Practical Character Reader book. So, anyways, that's the. I think that's we've covered this pretty well. This is a shambles on their part. I think this might be an indicator that they are running out of competent people to write their narratives and their stories.
Yeah, it's like, is this really the best they could come up with? I don't know. Like, again, I kind of think she decided to do this more or less on her own volition, simply because it turns her on.
Or yeah, and I was basically just going to say, or to get the public spotlight, but same motivation behind that as well. If we were to keep going here, so this genuinely does seem like she stitched this together in an afternoon. Maybe had a couple of office workers help her out with it to get some of the references down into the document, and then I don't know, put this out into the public for the spotlight, the news time slots, and really just try to show that she's working for the cause. Maybe it'll get her some fancy new job in the future if she wins. I don't know, but this is I personally, if I were on their side and I was sitting in the back rooms trying to calculate out how to really screw over like the normal people in the United States and really just sort of dissolve the country, I would be incensed that this is what happened. This is you would genuinely have to be either just like an ideological being that has absolutely no regard for any sort of truth or reality or anything like that, or you would have to be like maybe a kindergartner to buy all of this. This isn't good.
I mean, our politicians, our political class, and our media class are both kindergartners and ideological lunatics, but
very true. And I'm not saying that as like some funny insult. or whatever, even though that, you can say it's a rather verbose insult, but that's genuinely sort of like the mental faculties you'd have to have in order to genuinely believe this. You can half-heartedly believe this in order to win arguments if you're like a lefty public school teacher, or like a librarian or whatever. I don't know who keeps up with this stuff to the degree we do and actually supports it. Most of those people just seem to look at the news, get their line, and start parroting it. But I don't know who genuinely believes everything that was put in here to the point where they would where they think that is reality and that this was a good argument. Like, was it like the four cat ladies? I don't know.
No, I can't believe any serious person would actually believe this stuff at this point. I mean, like I said, there's so much video footage of the behind the scenes goings on in the Capitol, of police operatives sort of changing costumes, opening doors, obviously conspiring to some end. I mean, it's not even theorized, just on tape. You can go see the tapes. There's no other way to interpret it other than these are agent provocateurs. I mean, come on.
And since we're not me, not you, if you wanted to say something real quick, I was going to just go to a tangential topic, but you first.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to do the same. Does anyone remember that there was like some sort of commission about what happened, like, and they had hearings?
Oh yeah.
Well, that's specifically being used as evidence in this report.
Yes, that's well. The thing about this report too is she's basically just copy pasting the Colorado case, but the Colorado case relies heavily on that, which I think I pointed out on an Old Glory Club stream. The problem with these congressional hearings is they sort of have the trappings of like a judicial proceeding, but there's no opportunity for cross-examination. There's no actual defense. The hearings are simply there to accumulate this giant volume of evidence for the prosecution under the guise that it's been proven in court. Trump's lawyers actually, claim that this stuff isn't admissible, but the Colorado Supreme Court disagreed. But yeah, the point of those hearings was to build up this entire pseudo case and create this one-sided like mountain of evidence that would then only be responded to, with very little time remaining. Like basically Trump's lawyers, I'm sure they've been working on this in anticipation, but ultimately they're given very little time to actually address any of the particular evidence that is being thrown against him, because it's the entire volume of everything that's been in these congressional hearings.
Right. Typically with these congressional hearings, what they're used for is so that Congress doesn't actually have to go through like some judicial proceeding in order to get facts for a debate on the floor.
Yeah.
Or for a bill or something. That's what this is for. This is, so go on, not me, not you.
Well, it's just like citation generation on Wikipedia. Like you want something to be believed by the public. You want something to end up on Wikipedia. You have a couple of journalists write articles about it. They don't have to cite anything. They don't have to, actually bring out any facts. And then that citation ends up in Wikipedia, which is then cited by other papers, which then ends up as a citation in Wikipedia. It's the same thing. It's just narrative generation. But like when I remember we watched the first on Patrick Casey's stream, the first day of the hearings, and it was like mock trial or like mock UN. Like the quality of the people that were engaged in this, they were like high schoolers. It was just amazing.
Right. I genuinely feel like if anyone watching takes away one point from any of this, it's that the regime is getting dangerously incompetent from its own standards. Dangerous, that is. That it's not able to craft a convincing narrative anymore. You basically have to be bought in already to believe this, which I don't think is true of some of their past narratives. I think some of their past narratives did legitimately fool people or seem plausible. This doesn't. Like, whenever you have the New York Times and CNN, and I presume all the other typical outlets, basically contradicting what is literally claimed in the report, I'm sure if you go off of what they're intending to mean, it's every time they say result, they mean coincided. Like that's pretty clear from the outset. But when they're saying that all of these deaths resulted from the violent actions of the protesters or whatever else, the mainstream propaganda organs are contradicting that. It's a very unique situation, very deteriorated in their capabilities, I think. So earlier, Charlie was talking about all this footage that's been released. and this is tangential. It's not really going to make some hard-hitting point, but this is the stream to talk about it if ever there was one. I remember the backlash about that when the new Speaker of the House released all that. I believe it was to the Blaze, so that they could comb through it. And I think Tucker Carlson got access. I forget, but there's this giant media storm where they were saying that government agencies should not be releasing these official documents to biased news agencies like the Blaze. And this has a lot of historical irony, of course, because the Watergate scandal was explicitly leaked to a moderate left-wing news journal, which was the so we're basically living through, if you wanted to have a modern parallel to something like Watergate, where you have an establishment coup over a very powerful presidential figure who's looking like he might actually reverse or severely weaken various different nodes of mainstream or establishment power, regime power, if you will. This does look very similar. It's just that it does sometimes look like some people might have learned piecemeal lessons from Watergate, like actually getting the people, your guys in Congress, to release the information to the public through your friendly media channels. That didn't happen in the 70s, but I don't feel like that any of them have learned nearly enough lessons, nor do they have the willpower. I think that's obvious. So, do any of you guys have anything that you want to add before we go on to Super Chats?
No, I just hope to see the year where we no longer have to talk about January 6th.
I hope to see the year when it becomes some kind of holiday for a new regime.
Yeah, so I believe... I don't know if it's exactly in the way that you just meant it, not me, not you, but I believe our good friend the Prudentialist actually has a video on holidays that touches on January 6th, but I'll have to see if I can find the link of that before we leave.
Yeah, I mean, it was, because if we're looking at what it was, the motivations of the people who went and the people who went to the original November, Million MAGA marches, it was people of the United States who saw who saw their country becoming a banana republic and did like the last ditch peaceful protest to try to stop it. It was pretty much the last rending of the veil. After January 6th, everything just kind of rolled back and the masks came off and we just saw the regime for what it was. So even if the people who were rioting failed in their intention to get the Mike Pence to do what was right, it still had good effects for delegitimizing the regime.
Right, and I think that's probably the biggest boon that came from any part of Trump's presidency, was just showing how absolutely malicious the regime is towards just normal American, especially heritage American people. This is something that I don't think was so internalized, especially in 2016. There was a general understanding or a general air that the establishment did not like normal Americans, and that was the word they would use, as establishment. It's sort of like a holdover from like John Birch Society lingo. If anyone wants to go and catch that stream that I did with Grant Brooks last Saturday, this is sort of the same wording that they would use then. One of the first dissident organizations in the country. But I think after Trump's presidency, one of the great utilities of it has been showing just how absolutely dead set every aspect of the regime is towards dissolving society, destroying the country, and absolutely curtailing and basically eliminating any sort of old American population. I think that's absolutely indisputable now. In fact, a variety of their propaganda organs seem to celebrate every one of those aspects. I feel like we've internalized that a great deal more than we had before the Trump presidency. What think you guys?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. They the Trump presidency really caused them to kind of go into. I mean, they didn't even have to, right? They didn't even have to throw the mask off and be like, "Oh, we have to get this done now." They kind of. I mean, a lot of other people have commented on this. It seems the regime is really huffing their own farts here. They're starting to really believe the propaganda that they put out. And that's like if you're just a cynical actor and you're putting this propaganda out to control the population, that's one thing. But when you start to believe it yourself, you start making a lot of mistakes because you're no longer operating within the frame of reality. You're operating within the frame of a narrative that you constructed for a specific purpose of controlling people.
Yeah, I mean, like I think I was saying yesterday on, was it the Old Glory Club stream, or that would have been Thursday. In any case, these people are. It's like their minds are living in a separate reality where Trump actually did win and overturn the results and became president. That's how they're acting. Even though materially none of that happened. They talk about. We reviewed one tweet where the tweet was claiming that there was some sort of irony in Trump, his lawyers making the case that his voters were being disenfranchised because of these ballot removals, and that's like ironic because apparently he disenfranchised millions of people, which doesn't make any sense because that's basically presuming that he won the election. I don't understand how he disenfranchised people when he lost and their guy won. It's like they literally live in a separate reality where they sort of believe that he actually won, even though he didn't. It's very bizarre. They're not cynical. They actually, on the whole, I think the regime does actually believe in their sort of orange man myth that he is this great evil, and they really believe in the sacred democracy, and they're like these great warriors for sacred democracy. And that's why they're so stupid, is because they actually believe in an alternate reality.
So I'm glad that you mentioned the disenfranchisement narrative because I had almost forgotten it. And it's very interesting because, as you mentioned, on the one hand, Trump disenfranchised literally billions of people. It's this great crime against humanity that Trump perpetrated, and it basically makes him a dictator. That's part of the narrative that they push forward, and it's part of the narrative that they've been pushing forward for a while, basically ever since the 1950s, is that disenfranchisement is the greatest evil that you can have in the sacred system of democracy. It's literally Satan, and if you don't oppose it hard enough, then you might as well be a Satanist in the sacred system. So that's narrative number one. And they claim that still to this day. It's just I basically tuned it out because it's so boring compared to this other stuff. But then also, the official narrative is that Biden won the black belt so hard in Georgia that that's why he won over Trump, especially with the mail-in ballots and whatnot else. So this is the narratives that they're crafting here they have mutually exclusive beliefs in them. So I don't really know what they're trying to go for now.
Now they're like claiming that disenfranchisement is good. Actually, like I linked this article that we looked at on the Old Glory Club stream, but you should bring it up because just the headline is so funny.
Yeah, one moment.
It reads: Voters seek to have Donald Trump removed from Illinois primary ballot. So like, it's so bizarre because it's saying the voters want to disenfranchise themselves because like, if the voters don't want to vote for him, they could just not vote for him, right? So like, why do the voters want? The voters don't even want the opportunity to not vote for him.
Yeah, in political science, this would be called a controlled democracy. This is where you control who is on the ballot so that people technically are choosing. They're just choosing pre-selected options by some sort of a entrenched system, typically. Usually, and this is typically included in like United States political mythology. Voters never ask for controlled democracy. The average person only ever wants full democracy, and that's why we have to spread it the world over. Unless, of course, you're in Illinois.
They're victim blaming here. They're saying, well, you, the voters, of course, what does voters even mean? A group of voters, like literally everyone's a voter. So it doesn't
people who have the right to vote. Yeah.
But it's like, you're voters. The voters are asking to be disenfranchised. It's not us doing it. You're asking to have the ballots controlled. It's like, come on.
I mean, a more honest headline would have been: voters seek to disenfranchise their peers on the other side of the political aisle. Like
you see, not me, not you. This is where you made a grave mistake in terminology. Disenfranchisement is whenever white supremacists try to keep blacks out of the ballot box by having like basic reading tests and mathematical diagrams on charts to be taken before you vote. I mean, that's clearly, and this is the official narrative. No black in the South could pass those tests. They just cannot read. They cannot tell you what the third triangle in the line of triangles is to put a dot inside of it. They cannot circle the second word in the sentence. And this is why we had to have the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So that's disenfranchisement is whenever you have like literacy tests. This, however,
they also don't have IDs. So
right. And it is literally impossible. I mean, the United States government, especially the bureaucracy, is perhaps the least diverse institution you could come across in the country. I mean, it's practically an old boys club from the South in there. But that's disenfranchisement. However, whenever voters want to get the scary man off the ballot, they're good patriotic groups of voters. That's not disenfranchisement. It's definitionally not. So I don't know. It's to make sure you don't pick the wrong option.
Yeah, I mean, send in the clowns, baby. That's just how it goes.
So this is a group of Illinois voters wants former President Donald J. Trump removed from the Illinois primary election in March.
This is just like the stuff like people claim happens in Russia, where like the Putin just wins because the opposition isn't allowed to win. I mean, people like make fun of Russia. It's like, well, what grounds is there even if you believe in this stuff to even do that at this point? It's like this is just fixing the elections at this point.
So if we want to talk about like Cold War narratives, this is literally how democracy worked in the Soviet Union. This is what Hollywood was loving about the Soviets, because they were the great pure democracy, was that you only had typically one or two names on the ballot. And if it was the incumbent, he was either to be reelected with a certain majority of the vote, or he would face some sort of penalty from the party. And this was seen as every single United States textbook will not tell you that detail, because it's so obvious that if that's the system you have, you just call it a controlled democracy or a dictatorship or a one-party state, and that's what it is. Everyone's just agreed on it, and that seems to me to be actually reasonable from the many mainstream narratives that are put forward. Except for when it happens here, in which case it's a group of concerned voters exercising their democratic rights of petitioning the state to ban certain people off the primary ballots of these private parties. And, like, it feels like we're speedrunning all of the different things that, like, these dictatorships and third world banana republics do. Like, Liberia is the famous example of like having a 10,000% voter turnout all for this one president. Like, I feel like we already had that one, so we've marked that one off the list. Now we're running over to Soviet democracy, where we control who's on the ballot, and I guess they just don't. We'll judge their mandate by turnout now, I guess, is what we'll do.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely are already there. We had like multiple counties in Michigan or Minnesota during the 2020 election that reported like 150% voter turnout. Like, we're already there.
Yeah, it's like the most annoying part. I'll just say in conclusion, the most annoying part of all of this is, especially if you're just regular person or whatever, if you're backing this maneuver to get him off the ballot, or you believe it, don't give me this nonsense like you're just interested in the enforcement of the law, and a bunch of stuff like that. Like you just want the ballots fixed so that the good guys only win and bad guys never win. Like, that's all you're doing. You don't actually care about democracy or whatever, or the strict enforcement of the law. It's all just pretense,
Yeah,
don't
you're
pretend.
Be dishonest.
It's insulting.
About it.
Yeah, don't insult me by pretending that like you have some deep interest in the law. You just want the good guys to win the elections. You just want the elections fixed. You want no one to be able to vote for, who you view as bad guys. That's all you're really doing. Don't give me this nonsense where you're pretending like this is just some sort of clinical interest in whatever's written in the Constitution, because that's not what you care about. Nobody cares about that.
Right, and I think that we're past the point now where we point out hypocrisy to like convince people. I don't think anyone cares. I think that at this point the only reason we would point out hypocrisy is just because it's insulting to us, and that's something that shouldn't go unanswered.
I'll play the game, but just don't insult me with this childish gibberish. Like you're very interested in my constitution and upholding the letter of the law. You don't care about that. Nobody cares about that anymore. Stop pretending that the political war that's going on is anything but exactly that. If you're on the anti-Trump side here,
right? So
I'm not going to insult you by making any pretenses either, right? So at least do me that favor and behave honorably.
Yeah, that is something that I've noticed, and certain moderate types do this as well. It's just not a defining characteristic. Basically, every dissident I've come across will just presume that you know what you're talking about if you're willing to talk about a subject until proven otherwise. They won't insult you by dumbing it down, and they certainly, usually most dissidents will not insult you by coming up with this chicken scratch of a court report if they were ever going to use it against you. I have a feeling that if any of our guys were empowered, despite our like a relative lack of experience governing, I feel like any one of us probably could have come up with a better court document than what was just presented. Like even if it didn't follow like traditional standards or whatever, like I'm sure I know for a fact that one didn't either. The diction and the layout and all this other stuff was certainly very strange. It's alien to to how court reports read from 50 years ago. Certainly, I feel like we could have done a better job. I feel like that sort of competence expected of everyone is a level of respect that we have for each other, certainly, and perhaps too much respect for our opponents than anyone on the other side has for anyone. Like this is they're purely entropic in their relationships. I feel like.
Yeah, I mean that's the nature of the bio-Leninist system, right? Like they're elevated to these positions of power simply for the fact that they're not able to rock the boat. They don't have the capacity for it. So they pen these barely literate decisions to just signal their allegiance to the regime. It's just ridiculous.
It's like these people who put in these pretenses are all Grima Wormtongue. Like if you're going to be the bad guy, at least be Saruman and just be straight up like, yes, I'm betraying you. I'm siding with the bad guy. I'm really powerful.
Yeah, look at this epic reveal that I have. Yeah.
Yes, it's like don't be, if you're gonna be the bad guy, be Saruman and not Grima Wormtongue, because it's just pathetic the other way around.
Right. Yeah. So and that's I genuinely feel like most of the people in power might have more sympathy for Wormtongue than they do for Saruman.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, and that not as in they parallel them more, because that would be an external thing that we had observed. I feel like they would they're in such a pitiful state, they probably like him better than Saruman. I can't prove that, but I think that everyone here probably knows that that's closer to the truth than not. That's the pitiful state of what we're being governed under. We're subject to these people. We are subjects, and these are the glorious rulers that have been put over us. Our rulers are women and children, if you want to go to the ancient curse from the prophet Isaiah. So with that being said, I think we can move on to super chats now. We've had some very generous donations today. So Lancelot DeLake for $20, thank you very much, sir, says, "We must never forget the sheer absurdity of what we collectively went through. The amount of hostile psychological manipulation we were subject to. The impossible contradictions we were demanded to accept. Never, ever forget." And that's exactly why I'm doing the stream, is because, to be perfectly honest, I don't think that we added too terribly much new here. I think most people, if they really wanted to, probably could have gone through the main Secretary of State report, probably could have had a laugh on their own, maybe gotten more angry without the laughs, who knows. But, we were just rehashing stuff here and putting it on the record, just because we can't forget. This is Stephen Carson always likes to pull up the quote that the battle against tyranny is a battle of not forgetting, or a battle of remembering, and that's probably the truest thing that we can say outside of like Holy Writ.
Pretty obvious when they bring up the coronavirus stuff, right? They're like, "Oh, just forget about it, man. Why are you still like worried about all that? That's in the past." It's like, well, no, we're not going to forget. They're actually really scared of you not forgetting.
Yeah, it's also imperative that we make chronicles to pass down to our progeny, like for posterity, because looking for any kind of widely circulated information about what was going on during the years that we were witnessing in 20 years, 30 years, it's all, unless we win, and unless we've won by then, the official narrative is going to be something that is completely just, false. It's going to be the falsehoods that we've already seen. So anyone who's inclined to journal or something like that, keeping a physical record of what you've experienced for posterity is a worthy endeavor.
Right. So this is why the cry "Never Forget" is so powerful as well, and it's been used across many a movement throughout history. It's basically ancient. I would not be shocked if you find variations of it. I know you can in the medieval era of not forgetting specific tragedies or occurrences. Certainly, you can in the Reformation era, the early modern era. This is the cry that every tyrant fears: is the population not forgetting. So everyone, remember, I think, is what we can go with here. This is why I do this, is so that we can remember things as they happen. This is why I dig up the old history, is so specifically we can remember, and so that we don't have to be beholden to the web of lies that have been spun that we're supposed to accept. Like I might remind people, it's like a comically dystopic to force people, basically at threat of violence or incarceration, to accept obvious contradictions. Like that's like the over the top, never going to happen example from 1984 or from any other major dystopia, and that's literally what is happening right now in the court system. It's not literally 1984 because everything isn't gray. We don't have these giant brutalistic buildings of Stasi agents. We have normal people who may or may not inform upon you to get you locked in solitary confinement for rebelling. As happened to the one gentleman. So we live in something much more bland, much more subtle, I think, than any of the dystopias. But that doesn't mean that the lessons shouldn't be learned. So that's all I was going to say there. Portler, for a very generous $49.99, says 4D chess insurrection, standing down and stand by. Trump is still battling Obama's deep state in the underground tunnels. 2 more weeks. Keep up the good work. Thank you very much. I did find those. I did find the sort of prognostications from Q and the Q shamans and all that to be sort of entertaining during that whole election season. You guys remember that?
Remember what specifically? The
all the different like Q pronouncements and then Q adjacent pronouncements about how.
Oh yeah, salute to all of our troops still fighting in the dumbs, liberating the children locked in there, in the cages, deep underneath the congressional halls. Yeah.
Right. So I appreciate it, Bortler. Thank you very much for the very generous donation. K. Lewis for a generous $2 says poo poo pee pee caca pee poo. Here's $2. Thank you very much, K. Lewis. I very much appreciate it.
He's just describing what he's currently seeing in California.
or what was scrawled upon the documents that came out of the recesses of the state Secretary of Maine. I mean that's same level basically. After a certain point below the threshold, it's the same amount of crap. So thank you, K. Lewis, for the $2. Vitlaus for 99 cents. Thank you very much. No donation is too small here. I very much appreciate any and all that anyone is willing to give. So yeah, thank you very much, Vitlaus. And then Portler for another $9.99 says, "Voters could be here. I hate voters." The cold wind. He felt the cold wind against his bare chest. Yeah. Thank you very much, Portler. So with that, I have your links in the descriptions. Not me, not you, and Charlemagne, but just left to right here on the screen. Where can people find me or find you? Not me, not you.
You can find me on Twitter. I believe my handle is not me, not you. Also, and just keep an eye on the Old Glory Club. That's the most important part of this public-facing thing that I do.
Yeah, and then Charlemagne.
Yes, you can find me on my YouTube channel, Charlemagne, my blog, Neo Reactor, and also, most importantly, on the Old Glory Club YouTube channel and Substack. Also go to theoldgloryclub.com. Bookmark that website for the future as developments happen. There will be more there.
Yeah, all of us here on this panel are actively working on the Old Glory Club, so go check that out. Substack. There's a website that debuted on Millennial this year, and if you are interested in founding or joining a chapter, we really need chapter founders, people that are the brave few, the brave five that are willing to put their names on the legal documents with us and become a legal entity within their local area. We need those founders. Specifically. So if you have any interest at all, email theoldgloryclub@gmail.com and we will get back to you, I'm certain. So with that, I will see you all next Saturday, I believe. Thank you for everyone in the chat. There was quite the fun discussion going on throughout all of this. So yeah, with that out of the way, I will we'll be back next Saturday. I believe that'll be the last Saturday that I have before the semester starts up again. And I don't know what we'll be covering, so I'll have to come up. I'll have to see what might be a good story for next week. With that, thank you both of you all for joining me here, and I will see all of you next week. Goodbye, everyone.
Be well.